The world is cruel to the weak. It feeds on fragility, sharpening its teeth on the bones of those who dare to stand unguarded. In the cold outskirts of Saint-Isidore, Quebec, a boy walked alone, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of invisible chains. He was not yet a fighter, not yet a name carved into history, just a scared child, eyes cast downward, praying that today would not be the day they found him again. The schoolyard was a battleground, but there were no rules. Fists came from nowhere. Voices spat venom, and hands reached to strip him of more than just his money. They took his pride, his peace, his sense of self. He learned to navigate the chaos like prey in a world of predators, knowing the scent of fear was his greatest curse. Each day, the same brutal lesson was taught. Survival belongs to the strong. He saw no escape, no savior, only the endless cycle of humiliation and pain. But deep within him, something ancient stirred. It was not anger, nor was it vengeance. It was resolve. The embers of defiance glowed within his ribs, whispering that he was more than a victim. He did not know it yet, but suffering was shaping him, hardening his bones into steel. Every punch that landed, every insult that cut deep, was forging a warrior. He would not run forever. One day the hunted would become the hunter. The boy they tormented would rise from the dirt they buried him in. He would wear his scars like armor, move like a shadow, strike like a storm. They didn't know it yet, but the boy they broke would one day stand before millions, unshaken, unbreakable. His name was Georges St-Pierre, and this was where his legend began. The air inside the dojo smelled of sweat and discipline. Wooden floors, worn from the relentless pounding of feet, bore witness to battles waged in silence. Georges stood at the edge of the mat, his small hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding like war drums inside his chest. He was no longer in the schoolyard, no longer prey. This was a different battlefield, one ruled by honor, precision, and control. His father had brought him here not to fight, but to transform. The first time he bowed before his instructor, he felt the weight of something greater than himself. Kyokushin karate was not just movement, it was philosophy, a way of life. Every strike had purpose. Every block was a shield against the world that had sought to break him. Georges trained like a man possessed, as if survival depended on each perfect kick, each sharpened stance. He learned to see not just with his eyes, but with his instincts, to anticipate, to react, to command his body as a weapon of will. The bullies who had once towered over him, who had laughed as he shrank beneath their fists, were no longer nightmares in his mind. They were fuel. Every humiliation, every tear shed in silence, fed the inferno raging inside him. But strength alone was not enough. His master taught him that true power came not from rage, but from control. The greatest warriors did not fight out of anger. They fought to perfect themselves, to master the war within before conquering the war outside. Georges listened, absorbing every word like scripture. He was still just a boy, but the prey was disappearing. In its place, something new was rising, something fearless, something destined for greatness. The world outside the dojo had not changed, but Georges had. The bullies who once owned the hallways with their smirks and fists no longer saw a scared boy flinching at their shadows. He walked differently now, his spine unbowed, his steps deliberate. There was something in his eyes, something unreadable. Not arrogance, not challenge, but a quiet storm, waiting. They sensed it. Predators always knew when prey had grown claws. One of them tested him, cornering him near the lockers, expecting the same trembling fear, the same submission. But fear no longer ruled Georges. He didn't hesitate. His fists moved faster than his thoughts, faster than the bully's reflexes. A single sharp strike, a lesson delivered in the language of those who only understood force. The boy staggered, stunned, not just by the hit, but by the realization that Georges St-Pierre was no longer his victim. He never would be again. Word spread. The weak kid was gone, and in his place stood something they couldn't quite define. But Georges did not celebrate. He did not revel in his victory. He knew this was only the beginning. Strength was nothing without discipline. Power without purpose was just violence. He returned to the dojo with more hunger, more obsession. Every strike became sharper. every movement, a whisper of future greatness. But it was not enough. Karate had given him a foundation, but the world was bigger than one art. One night in 1993, everything changed. Georges watched Royce Gracie, a smaller man, dismantle giants in a cage with nothing but technique and intelligence. The fire inside him roared. This was the key. This was the next step. Georges had taken his first step toward becoming a warrior. Now he would become something even more dangerous, a mixed martial artist. The journey had only just begun, but Georges knew the path ahead would be carved in sweat and sacrifice. There were no shortcuts, no easy roads. If he wanted to stand among the greats, he had to tear himself apart and rebuild. Stronger, sharper, unstoppable. He sought out the best, those who could push him beyond his limits. But there was a problem. The world of elite martial arts didn't exist in Quebec. Jiu-Jitsu, wrestling, Muay Thai, these arts were ghosts in his homeland. If he wanted to evolve, he had to leave behind comfort, familiarity, and everything he knew. He had to chase the fire. With nothing but raw ambition and empty pockets, he packed his bag and traveled to New York City. The first time he stepped into Renzo Gracie's gym, he was just another hopeful fighter. He spoke barely a word of English. He had no money, no guarantees. All he had was hunger. He walked onto the mats, eager to prove himself, but the reality was brutal. The first time he rolled with a real Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, he was crushed. Over and over, he was outmaneuvered, outclassed, humiliated. The man who had stood undefeated in his small world now found himself drowning in an ocean of skill. But Georges did not break. He endured. Every submission, every painful tap, every moment of suffocating failure, it was fuel. He learned, he adapted. He stayed longer, trained harder, returned every day with a vengeance. Pain became his teacher. Defeat became his blueprint for dominance. The predators of his childhood had turned him into a fighter, but these masters of combat would turn him into something even deadlier. Georges St-Pierre was no longer fighting to survive. He was fighting to conquer. The transformation had begun. Georges was no longer just a student of martial arts. He was becoming a machine, engineered for battle. He lived on the edge of exhaustion, pushing his body beyond the limits of reason. The bruises on his skin were maps of his progress, each one a lesson learned in blood and struggle. He traveled between disciplines, absorbing knowledge like a man possessed. Muay Thai sharpened his strikes, wrestling forged his takedowns, Jiu-Jitsu made him a ghost in the grip of giants. He learned to flow, to adapt, to think like a predator. But survival was not enough. He wanted more. He wanted domination. The world of professional fighting loomed before him, a battlefield where only the strongest endured. His first professional fight came in 2002. The cage was smaller than he imagined, the crowd louder, the moment heavier. His opponent was a dangerous man, a seasoned fighter who had already tasted blood under the bright lights. But Georges felt no fear. The years of torment, the sacrifices, the pain, it had all led here, before it had even begun. Victory. His hand was raised, but he barely heard the cheers. There was no satisfaction, no relief, only a realization. This was just the first step. The climb had begun, and at the top of the mountain stood the legends. If he wanted to reach them, he would have to keep moving, keep evolving, keep hunting. The world would soon know the name Georges St-Pierre. The road to greatness was paved with sacrifice. Georges knew this better than anyone. There were no easy fights, no mercy in the cage. Every opponent was a test, every battle a war. He tore through Canada's fight scene like a storm, leaving destruction in his wake. The victories piled up, but his hunger only grew. He wanted the biggest stage, the fiercest competition, the ultimate proving ground. There was only one place for that, the UFC. The call came in 2004, the moment he had been waiting for. His UFC debut was against a veteran, a fighter with experience, power, and confidence. But Georges had something greater: obsession. The bell rang, and the world witnessed the birth of a future champion. He was faster, sharper, relentless. Every takedown was explosive, every strike calculated. When the final horn sounded, his opponent was broken, beaten, unable to stop the onslaught. His hand was raised and the UFC had a new rising star. But success was a double-edged sword. With each victory came new enemies, new threats. He was no longer an underdog, no longer underestimated. He was now a target. And at the top of the welterweight division stood a giant, a legend, Matt Hughes, the most dominant welterweight champion in UFC history, a man who had crushed every challenger before him. Georges had earned his shot, but standing across the cage from Hughes was different from anything he had ever faced. The pressure was suffocating. The lights burned hotter than ever before, and as the fight began, he realized something chilling. He was not ready. The cage door locked and reality hit like a sledgehammer. This was not just another fight. This was a war against a legend. Matt Hughes was not like the others. He was a juggernaut, a relentless force who had ruled the division with an iron grip. Georges had trained for this, visualized it 1,000 times, but the moment swallowed him whole. His nerves betrayed him. His confidence wavered. Across from him stood a man who had already won this fight in his mind before it even began. The first exchange told the story. Hughes was faster than expected, stronger than imagined. Every move Georges made was countered, every attack neutralized. He tried to strike, but Hughes smothered him. He tried to escape, but the champion was a wall of muscle and experience. Panic crept in. Then came the mistake. A brief hesitation, a moment of doubt. Hughes seized it like a predator. The takedown was brutal, the transition seamless. Georges felt his arm trapped before he even realized what had happened. The pain was immediate, sharp, undeniable. He fought it, but there was no escape. He had seconds before his arm snapped. The choice was clear: tap or risk permanent damage. Shame burned through him as his hand hit the canvas. It was over. The dream shattered. The belt stayed with Hughes. Georges walked out of the cage with his head low, the sting of defeat cutting deeper than any wound. But he would not break. That night, a promise was made. He would never feel this helpless again. He would rebuild, evolve, become something Hughes had never seen before. Next time, it would be different. Next time, he would not be denied. Defeat was a scar, but scars were lessons written in pain. Georges refused to let his loss to Hughes define him. It would forge him. He dissected every mistake, every hesitation, every weakness that had betrayed him inside that cage. The problem wasn't just physical, it was mental. He had fought like a challenger, not a champion. That would never happen again. His training intensified, reaching an obsession that bordered on madness. He hunted down the best minds in combat sports, absorbing techniques like a machine processing data. Striking, wrestling, Jiu-Jitsu, he would master them all. He traveled, sought out the strongest training partners, and transformed himself into something new. The fear that had gripped him before Hughes was gone. Now there was only hunger. He tore through the division like a man possessed. 1 victory, 2, 5. He did not just win, he dominated. Each opponent fell before him, unable to withstand the storm he had become. The UFC could no longer deny it. He had earned another shot at Hughes. But this time, it would not be the same. This was not the same Georges St-Pierre. He was faster, stronger, smarter, more dangerous than ever before. The rematch was set. The world held its breath. The reigning champion, the greatest welterweight in UFC history, would face a challenger reborn in fire. The hunted had become the hunter, and this time, there would be no mercy. The rematch was more than a fight. It was destiny. The world still saw Matt Hughes as the immovable king, the welterweight titan who had ruled for years. But Georges knew the truth. He was no longer the same man who had crumbled beneath Hughes' dominance. That Georges had died the night he tapped out. What stood in his place was something faster, stronger, and mercilessly precise. The arena pulsed with electricity as the cage door locked. Georges felt none of the doubt that had once poisoned him. There was no fear, no hesitation, only cold, calculated destruction waiting to be unleashed. The bell rang. This time Hughes did not smother him. This time, Hughes could not control him. Georges dictated the fight with sniper-like precision, landing crisp strikes that rattled the champion. Hughes, who had once seemed invincible, looked human, slower, vulnerable. The moment came like a lightning strike. Georges fainted, then ended. The belt, the symbol of everything Georges had come. Every welterweight in the UFC wanted what he had. They wanted his title, his legacy, his crown. The weight of greatness was heavier than he had imagined, but he did not flinch. Instead, he trained harder, preparing for every possible threat. Then disaster struck. His first title defense was set against Matt Serra, a fighter the world saw as an underdog, a stepping stone for Georges' reign. The odds were overwhelming, 11-1 in favor of the champion. But odds meant nothing in the chaos of combat. The fight began, and at first it seemed like another masterclass from Georges. He moved with precision, controlled the distance, imposed his will. Then in a moment that shook the world, everything changed. Serra launched a wild right hand, and it found its mark. A single punch that shattered the invincible image of Georges St-Pierre. His legs betrayed him, wobbling beneath the weight of the impact. Serra saw it, smelled blood, and attacked like a man possessed. Another punch, then another. The cage was no longer an arena, but a storm Georges couldn't escape. He tried to recover, tried to fight back, but the onslaught was too much. The referee dove in. It was over. The mighty had fallen. The belt was gone. The world was in shock. Georges lay on the canvas, staring at the ceiling, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief. He had climbed the mountain, only to be thrown from its peak. But this was not the end. No, this was just the beginning of something greater. A fire had been lit inside him, a fire that would burn until he reclaimed everything that had been stolen from him. Humiliation is a ruthless teacher. The echoes of Serra's fist still rang in Georges' mind long after the fight had ended. He had lost before, but this was different. This was not just defeat, this was a reckoning. The world no longer saw him as invincible. The whispers began. Maybe he was never truly great. Maybe he was just another fighter who had crumbled when the pressure was real. But Georges knew better. He knew why he lost. He had let the world convince him that he was untouchable. He had lost his edge, his hunger. He had trained for a victory he thought was inevitable, instead of preparing for war. That mistake had cost him everything. It would never happen again. He vanished from the noise, retreating into the shadows to rebuild. But this was not just about training, it was about transformation. Georges sought out not just the best trainers, but the best minds. He surrounded himself with masters of every discipline, forging himself into something new, something unbreakable. He changed his mentality. He no longer trained to win. He trained to eliminate risk, to leave nothing to chance, to impose his will with suffocating precision. The reckless young fighter who had walked into the cage against Serra no longer existed. What emerged was a machine, flawless, calculating, relentless. The UFC had no idea what was coming. Georges St-Pierre had been reborn, and the hunt for redemption had begun. The rematch was inevitable. And this time, there would be no underestimation, no mistakes. The next time he stepped into the cage with Matt Serra, he wouldn't just take back his title. He would make sure the world never doubted him again. The road to redemption was not paved with second chances. It had to be carved from stone, forged in suffering, and earned through obsession. Georges had rebuilt himself from the ground up, stripping away the weaknesses that had betrayed him. He was no longer a man who relied on talent or athleticism. He was something colder, sharper, mercilessly efficient. He had transformed into a fighter who left nothing to chance, a strategist who controlled every second of combat. The rematch against Serra was announced. The world watched, waiting to see if GSP would crumble under the weight of his own failure. But Georges had already won this fight long before it was scheduled. The battle had been fought in the endless hours of training, in the sweat that soaked the mats, in the moments of pain where he pushed past what was humanly possible. Serra had taken everything from him once. It would not happen again. The cage door locked. The crowd roared, but Georges heard nothing. There was no emotion in his eyes, no hesitation in his movements. From the opening bell, he suffocated Serra with pressure, closing the distance, dictating the fight with ruthless precision. The challenger never stood a chance. Georges drove him to the canvas, pinning him to the mat like prey caught in the jaws of a predator. Every strike, every transition, every second was a statement. This is my cage, my division, my destiny. Sarah had shocked the world once, but lightning would not strike twice. His knees crashed into his body like wrecking balls, breaking his will, shattering his resistance. He curled up under the storm, unable to escape. The referee dove in. It was over. Georges St-Pierre had reclaimed his throne. But this time, he was not just a champion. He was the ruler of the welterweight division, and he would never fall again. The belt was back around his waist, but Georges knew the truth. This was only the beginning. Champions win titles. Kings rule over them. He had spent years chasing greatness, but now he was ready to define it. The welterweight division was no longer a battlefield. It was his empire. And anyone who dared step into his world would learn the price of challenging its ruler. The challengers came, one after another, each one believing they had what it took to dethrone him. They were bigger, stronger, dangerous in their own ways. But it didn't matter. Georges had transcended the chaos of brawlers and the recklessness of wild strikers. He was a tactician now, a machine of precision. He fought not with emotion, but with cold, calculated violence. John Fitch, a relentless grinder who had never been broken, stepped forward. He had dominated everyone before him, but Georges was different. For 5 rounds, he dissected Fitch with surgical precision, outclassing him in every aspect of the fight. Fitch refused to fall, absorbing punishment that would have shattered another man. But survival was not victory. When the final bell rang, there was no doubt. Georges had erased any question of who ruled the division. But the war was far from over. There was another storm brewing. A fighter from the past, a man whose skill was unquestioned, whose mind was as sharp as his hands, BJ Penn. The prodigy wanted revenge. He had lost to Georges before, but he swore this time would be different. He claimed he would break Georges, but Georges had spent years erasing the word breakable from his soul. This was not the same fighter Penn had faced before. The rematch was set, but this would not be a fight. It would be an execution. The world called BJ Penn a prodigy, a man gifted with otherworldly talent, a fighter who could do what others couldn't. But Georges didn't believe in talent. He believed in work, in sacrifice, in obsession, and obsession would always devour talent. Penn talked like a man who had already won, promising to retire Georges, to break him in front of the world. He said Georges would quit on his stool, that he would fold under the weight of true greatness. But Georges had heard those words before. They were spoken by men who didn't understand what he had become. The cage door locked and the war began. From the first exchange, the gap was clear. Penn was skilled, but Georges was on another level. He did not just fight Penn, he suffocated him. He weaponized control, dragging Penn into deep waters and watching him struggle. Georges turned the fight into a war of attrition, where skill alone meant nothing. He broke Penn's rhythm, erased his comfort, and reduced the so-called prodigy into a man gasping for air. The rounds passed like a slow death. Georges did not rush. He did not need to. He dismantled Penn brick by brick, exposing every weakness the legend had tried to hide behind his arrogance. By the end of the 4th round, Penn's body had betrayed him. His face swollen, his spirit crushed, his corner did what he refused to do. They ended it. The fight was over. The prodigy had been broken. As Georges stood in the center of the cage, victorious, he didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. His statement had been made. He was no longer just a champion. He was an era. The division had been conquered, but Georges was not satisfied. A true king does not sit on his throne. He defends it, and challengers never stop coming. The UFC threw its best warriors at him, each one convinced they would be the one to solve the puzzle, the one to take what he had built. They all failed. Thiago Alves, a wrecking machine with vicious power, promised to end the reign. Georges neutralized him, out-wrestled him, broke his will. Dan Hardy, a fearless striker, swore he would not be dominated. Georges made him look helpless, dragging him into a world he could not escape. Jake Shields, a submission specialist, believed his ground game would be the difference. Georges shut him down, forcing him into a striking battle he had no hope of winning. Each fight was another masterpiece, another display of complete control. The world was beginning to understand. Georges St-Pierre was not just a champion. He was a force, an equation that no fighter could solve. But domination comes with a cost. The pressure was suffocating. The expectation was absolute. Every fight was not just a defense. It was survival against the weight of perfection. He was no longer just fighting opponents. He was fighting the world, fighting time, fighting the inevitable truth that every king eventually falls. The stress gnawed at him. The hunger that had once fueled him was now chained by the burden of staying at the top. But George was not ready to break. Not yet. There was still one more war to fight, one more challenger to silence. The most dangerous of them all, a man who did not respect him, who spat in the face of greatness. Nick Diaz. The storm was coming. And George would be ready. Nick Diaz was not like the others. He did not just want to fight George. He wanted to humiliate him, to tear down the legacy he had built. He called George a coward, accused him of avoiding real fights, mocked his respect, his discipline, his very identity. He spat venom into every microphone placed before him, daring George to lose control, to break character, to step into the chaos that Diaz thrived in. But George was not a man who played into emotion. He was not a man who let words become weapons. He let his fists speak. The fight was set, the tension suffocating. The night of the war arrived. The arena shook with energy, the crowd divided between loyalty and rebellion. The moment the cage door locked, Diaz unleashed his mind games, taunting, dropping his hands, daring George to brawl. But George did not brawl. He hunted. He drowned Diaz in his game plan, dictating every second of the fight with ruthless efficiency. The Stockton gangster, who had broken so many men with his pressure, found himself smothered. Every taunt was met with a takedown. Every insult was silenced by a fist. 5 rounds. 5 rounds of absolute control. Diaz fought with defiance, but defiance could not stop the inevitable. When the final bell rang, there was no doubt. George had dismantled the storm before it could rage. His hand was raised, his throne untouched. But as the roar of victory echoed through the arena, a new voice whispered in the back of his mind. He had won again. He had defended his empire. But how much longer could he carry the weight of a kingdom no one could conquer? Victory had become routine, but something was different. George was winning, but he was no longer celebrating. Each fight was another war, another defense, another moment where perfection was the only acceptable outcome. He was not fighting challengers anymore. He was fighting expectation, fighting time, fighting the burden of being untouchable. The world didn't just expect him to win, they expected him to dominate. Every second inside that cage felt heavier, every camp more exhausting. The hunger that had once driven him had turned into an obsession with never losing. The line between greatness and suffering had blurred. The pressure was relentless. Outside the cage, the questions began. How much longer could he carry this weight? Did he still love this? Was he still the same warrior who had clawed his way from nothing? George tried to silence those thoughts, but they lingered like ghosts. Then came the fight against Johny Hendricks, a powerhouse, a wrecking ball with fists that had sent men crumbling to the canvas. He was young, fearless, and dangerous, the kind of threat George had spent his life preparing for. The fight was a war. Hendricks did what no man had done before. He pushed George to the edge. The champion bled, staggered, absorbed damage that would have broken others. For the first time in years, doubt flickered in the eyes of the world. The final bell rang. The decision was razor thin. The judges gave it to George. But as his hand was raised, there was no joy, no triumph, just exhaustion. The storm had passed, but something inside him had changed. The moment the cameras were on him, he spoke the words no one expected. I need to step away. The empire had not fallen, but its king had walked away from the throne. The words sent shockwaves through the MMA world. Georges St-Pierre was stepping away. Not retiring, not defeated, just gone. He held the belt, unbeaten, untouchable, but something inside him had cracked. The pressure, the endless wars, the weight of being perfect, it had drained him. He had spent years preparing for every opponent, but no one had prepared him for this, for the silence, for life without the fight. The UFC scrambled, the fans debated, but Georges had made up his mind. He had given everything to the sport, and now he was taking something back. His freedom. He disappeared from the spotlight, retreating into a life he had never known. No training camps, no weight cuts, no cameras waiting for every word he spoke. He lived, traveled. He studied the mind, the body, the science of performance. For the first time in years, he was no longer a machine built for combat, but the fire never truly died. It smoldered beneath the surface, waiting. As the months turned to years, the sport evolved. A new generation rose. New champions claimed their thrones. But in every conversation about the greatest of all time, his name still echoed. Unbeaten. Untouchable. The king who left before he could be dethroned. Then a whisper in the dark. Georges St-Pierre was training again. The world barely believed it. The UFC had moved on, but deep inside they knew the truth. Georges had never been just another fighter. He was a force, and forces do not fade. They return, stronger, sharper, more dangerous than ever before. The Leviathan had awakened, and this time he was coming for more than just a belt. 4 years. That was how long Georges St-Pierre had been gone. 4 years in exile, 4 years of silence while the sport moved forward without him. Fighters rose and fell. New champions were crowned. The world believed he was done. But legends do not fade. They wait, and when they return, they do so with fire in their veins and war in their eyes. The announcement shook the foundations of the fight world. Georges St-Pierre was coming back. But this was not just any return. He was not reclaiming the division he once ruled. He was hunting bigger prey, the middleweight championship, a weight class 15 pounds heavier, a challenge against a man built to destroy, Michael Bisping. The skeptics laughed. They said Georges was too small, too old, too far removed from the game. They forgot who they were talking about. This was a man who did not know how to return weak. A man who did not fight unless he knew he could win. Training became an obsession once again. The body that had once ruled the welterweight division was rebuilt for war. Every muscle, every breath, every ounce of preparation was sharpened to perfection. He was no longer just a fighter. He was a surgeon of violence, ready to dissect the man who held the title. The night arrived. Madison Square Garden, the biggest stage, the most impossible challenge. And as Georges St-Pierre stepped into the cage, there was no doubt he was not here for nostalgia. He was here to take everything. The cage door locked. The roar of Madison Square Garden faded into nothing. Georges had been here before, standing across from a man the world believed would stop him. But this was different. This was a battle against time itself, against doubt, against the impossible. Michael Bisping was bigger, stronger, a reigning champion with more momentum than ever. But Georges had not returned to be tested. He had returned to conquer. The fight began, and with it came the storm. Bisping came forward like a man defending his kingdom, throwing strikes with the confidence of a champion. But Georges was patient, precise. He moved like a ghost, slipping past danger, finding openings no one else could see. Then in the third round, the moment arrived. A left hook, clean, perfect, detonated against Bisping's skull. The champion wobbled. Georges pounced. A takedown. Elbows rained down, carving Bisping's face into a mask of crimson. And then, the final touch. The choke. A rear naked stranglehold, locked in with surgical precision. Bisping fought, struggled, but the grip was iron, forged in the fire of a lifetime spent chasing perfection. He tapped. It was over. Georges St-Pierre had done the impossible. He had returned after 4 years, moved up in weight, and taken the middleweight crown. The crowd erupted. History was rewritten. But as the belt was wrapped around his waist, Georges knew. This was the last war. He had climbed the mountain twice. He had defied the odds, silenced the doubters, conquered 2 divisions. There was nothing left to prove. He walked away once more, not as a fighter, but as a legend. Some men fight for victory, others fight for survival. Georges St-Pierre fought for mastery, and in the end, mastery was his.